All right. So just going to ask, because you all know what I always ask, which is simply, did you hear anything last week or in one of the previous classes that has stuck with you? Is there anything there that's of interest to you? Is this working for you? Okay.
Well, this is Sarah, and I'll say that I remember the 60s much better than the 50s because I was too small really in the 50s, but I didn't realize that primaries had been introduced in the 60s, which is like, oh, that's intriguing.
Now, I will tell you, just to make sure it's clear, the reality is primaries had been coming along since you have to realize the progressive movement, which spawned the primaries, the recall elections, the propositions, all of those kind of grew out of the progressive movement, which was big in the 1920s and 30s. So different states started launching them, but they were not utilized by the parties. It wasn't really, they did not assign delegates that way through the primaries the way we think of them today. And Kennedy just decided he was going to use that to be able to jump the line, and it did work for him, didn't it? So that's all good to know. All right, so there we go. Well, I am showing, it looks like you guys might have gone ahead and got that all filled out. It's showing 9 out of 9. So I'm going to go ahead and end the poll then, because we've got all that. And thank you so much. And I will check that out later. So excellent. Thank you. So now, can you still see me?
Yes.
Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yep.
All right. So I'll just ask, as you know, I've been using song lyrics out of each one to signify something of merit per each one. And just out of curiosity, why would I use "Saw a Deadhead Sticker on a Cadillac"? And does anybody know what the song is or who sang it? Okay.
Never heard of that one, Russ.
Okay, what it is it's Boys of Summer. It's from the 1980s, and it is by, and of course my brain just slipped away at the same time, but out of the Eagles, and so it's not the Eagles, but it's after they did this, he put this out, and it's kind of a bittersweet song. He's looking back to the past toward an old girlfriend. I can still see you, sunshine and on your golden hair and things like that. And the reality is, then he comes up and he's saying, he pulls, for like the third verse, he pulls up behind something and he says, "Saw a deadhead sticker on a Cadillac." Now, what would the significance of that be? Why would that sound so odd? The deadhead stickers, of course, are for people that followed the Grateful Dead. And if you're following the Grateful Dead, remember when the Grateful Dead went out to play, it's not like your normal concert. They could play all day or most of the night, or maybe both together. And, if a 3-minute song is good, well, a 30-minute or 40-minute or 60-minute song session or jam fest is better, right? It's like 10 to 20 times better. And everybody is in the crowd dancing and everything else. It's essentially, and they called themselves Deadheads, and they considered themselves a family. And you will still meet people today that will tell you how many of these they followed across the country. Because this continued on until Jerry Garcia passed away. And the point is, thank you, Don Henley. I appreciate that. So Don Henley, Boys of Summer. And the key is, and of course, Don Henley and the Eagles, when they were first coming up, They played as a backup band. They were out there on the road with these same people. And the point is, Deadhead Sticker, essentially you were the hippies that would follow these guys around. Because if you were going to follow them and go from place to place, almost like a caravan, you're not going to have a job and you're not going to have much for money. Now, as time goes by, that changes. And I used to go to conferences and I'd be in Chicago or I'd be somewhere on the East Coast, and somebody, would see that, oh, hey, the Grateful Dead are playing somewhere nearby. And one of them would say, oh, I've seen them 120 times. And somebody else in the room would go, oh, well, I've been to 301 of those. And somebody else would go, wow, that's really impressive. I'm over here going, that's incredibly impressive. But somebody else would join in and say, that's really impressive. I'm only at 401, so it's like, what? My point is, seeing a Deadhead sticker on a Cadillac is kind of a juxtaposition of oddities. One of these things is not like the other. Who's going to see a Cadillac with an expensive car with a Deadhead sticker? And why is that important? Because we're going to be thinking about what is the concept of the 80s and what's going on in the 80s. We're going to kind of hit that. So here we go. Now, as I said, I'd already asked you to share, and I think it was it Sarah that did. Let's take a look here. If this will still run for me. Yay. All right. So always asking, what do you remember from last week or the previous week? And while you're thinking about that, I'm just going to run through some of these events. We talked about the fact that the 70s started with Kent State. I didn't really specify the Weathermen bombings, but of course that was the counterculture that was actually trying, to get people's attention. The Chicago 7 get off, and remember, the Chicago 7 is this supposed conspiracy that created the riots in Chicago at the Democratic Convention in '68. Really, it was a stretch to even think that you were going to talk about, a conspiracy with 7 people who had never met each other. Only a few of them knew each other at all. I also mentioned in '71, the 26th Amendment passes, and that primarily speaks to this class as well, which is, I'm calling it power to the people. It's the extension of the vote. It's extending the vote out. So I want you to think about this. The whole concept, power to the people. We're making certain that the public is involved. And we've talked about that a couple of ways. The fact that you had the civil rights movement trying to really extend voting rights. And we saw in the 60s then, in the 50s, we saw the uprising to try to make that happen, and the registrations and things like that. The 60s, we saw the actual Voting Rights Acts and the Civil Rights Acts pass, which extended that. And out of that, we also saw that with that specific Civil Rights Act, they added women specifically into that in an effort to sink it, in an effort to stop it. Now, also notice in 1971, and of course, the 26th Amendment says we're going to allow, people 18 to vote. And the reason for that, of course, is 18-year-olds were serving in Vietnam, and it was a primary age for people. Now, plumbers, the White House forms a plumbers union. What the heck is that about? Well, it's, of course, a joke on words in the fact that the plumbers are people that are coming together because Nixon wants the leaks stopped and leaking of information. And of course, that really comes out with the Daniel Ellsberg Pentagon Papers, but it had started before that. And most of the people involved in it were ex-CIA or people that had been somewhat affiliated loosely with the CIA. But one of the primary ones, of course, between G. Gordon Liddy and the others, you've got this group who is going beyond things. They would do things that the FBI would never consider. And of course, that was break-ins, right? And in 72, we have a break-in at Watergate. And of course, Watergate is what? That's where the Democratic headquarters was. What was unknown at that time is they'd already broken into Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office looking for dirt to try to pressure him to stop. Now, the Equal Rights Amendment passes the Senate in 1972, and that's why all women from that point on, we don't have to worry about the Equal Rights Amendment is passed, and it now too is also that'd make it like the 27th Amendment, right? Wrong answer. It passed the Senate, but it did not get through all the states, so that was still in process. Very important one here, 1972, the Clean Water Act passes. And it's very interesting because Nixon, I've said, had no interest in domestic issues. All he was interested in was foreign affairs. And with that, excuse me. Okay. And with that, what he actually does is, I don't remember what the particulars were, but he decided to veto the Clean Water Act. Remember, Nixon did not win a majority of the votes, and thus he also did not win the House and Senate. So Congress was able to override his veto. And that's kind of a big thing and one of those items I want to mention. So, and I didn't mention this last week, but this was a earth-shaking moment when the Arabs broke into the Olympics. And today we'd just say terrorists broke into the Olympics, kidnapped and then killed the Israeli athletes. And just continuing along, 73, the Vietnam War ends, and then we get this thing, Roe v. Wade. Why do we care about, some sort of legal case? I mean, what do legal cases mean to us anyway, right? Of course, that is the one that has made abortions accessible. And that's really all they're saying, is that people have a right to have access to abortions. And then it also then limits what the what the time frame can be for those abortions. Now, also in 1973 is when on the tapes we can actually hear Richard Nixon discussing $1 million in bribes for the Watergate defendants. So I will just tell you, I've got a book over here on the shelf by an historian who actually likes to claim that Nixon knew nothing about the Watergate break-in or anything else. Then one might ask why he would be willing to pony up with $1 million in bribes. Also, another thing to remember, if you read through the transcripts of tapes, one of the things you're going to find on there is Nixon frequently is discussing how to raise off the books money. And generally that's by literally selling ambassadorships. Oh, that's worth $250,000 easy. So
Still being done.
Yeah. So with that, we've got then Nixon, actually ends up resigning in 74. And let's see if I can keep this going. And the energy crisis escalates, and we need to make it clear, why is the energy crisis suddenly escalating in 1974? Remember, in 1973, the Arab countries around Israel do a surprise attack for the Yom Kippur War, and with that, they actually are very successful for the first time. And Nixon, of course, this is his area. He is an expert at what you can do and what you can't do when it comes to foreign affairs. And he immediately mobilizes, puts the Russians on notice and says, we are going to be supplying these folks. Don't get in our way. Don't stop us. And we bring them arms and material at such a level that the Russians cannot do so. They cannot keep up. And that is a pretty impressive moment for that. So what actually comes to pass out of that, though, is that in doing so, he annoys the entire Arab world because, of course, they do defeat the Israelis do then go on to defeat in detail both the Egyptians and the rest, the Libyans and all the rest that are attacking. And what happens is most of those start pulling back. They decide they're going to decrease the amount of oil we can get. And that's where the original, they don't quite embargo it yet, but that's where the original efforts start. And that has a severe impact on the economy. But Nixon's gone in 74. 75, South Vietnam falls. The Maguez incident, that's where they had captured a ship in the area of Indonesia in the China Sea, and they're holding the crew. Ford and his team immediately swing into action, and they send Marines. Now they make it it's announced that it's the battle to take back the ship and rescue the crew is absolutely 100% successful with no casualties. But then about 2 weeks later, it comes out that, well, yes, except the diversionary attack on the main island, not where the ship was being held, I think, if I recall correctly, cost 44 American lives. So again, it's that issue of how the news is disseminated becomes important. Also remember that unemployment hits 9% at this point. Now, one of the things I did not say, I might have mentioned that, in reality, throughout this entire period that we've been talking about from 67 on, you've got demonstrations, you've got riots, so essentially with Vietnam demonstrations and riots, you got a lot of things going on, but the US was also tormented by terrorist attacks throughout all that. And I say that because you had the Weather Underground, you also have other groups that really are not identified. But in New York City, throughout this entire time period, essentially a bomb meaning dynamite, a bomb went off somewhere in New York City every day throughout this period. And it would take a while to get that. This is the bombing at 1975 at LaGuardia Airport in New York City. And that was kind of important to me because, some people I knew were passing through there at that point. I was kind of concerned. Now, remember, this is a big point I made last week, and we're going to have to talk about it a little bit at the end of this one, but this is why we're noting these things. Big change. I call it the huge bellwether change in American politics. As of 1976, it's the end of the professional politician. If you are truly a politician, and one could make an argument about Clinton or Bill Clinton, or one could make the argument perhaps about Bush, who we'll see yet today. But the key thing is, if you are a politician, you have to mask it, because look at this group that I've got on the cover there of Newsweek. Those are all big time, big name politicians. Jerry Brown up in the upper right corner is the least of these at that point, and he's still around today making his living as a politician. And then just to end out 77 to 79, I didn't mention this last week, and I'm not sure how I could talk about the 70s and not mention Star Wars showed up. So Star Wars is born in 77, and do you think that has just a little bit of some legs to it? Because in reality, this is a big impact issue for a lot of people. Now, at the same time, 77 Star Wars is born and Elvis departs. And that's That's also a big deal because in my mind, you can almost make the argument that 77, 78 by 1980 easily, the first wave of rock and roll is kind of shifting off the stage. They're no longer the primary people. That's a little shaky, and of course there's a lot of overlap, but with Elvis's death, it's there. Now, of course, big thing, 1978, Egypt and Israel sign a peace accord. And, of course, everybody signs these things. They never honor them. I just will mention to you that this one, and of course, it had been Egypt, and at that time under Nasser, that had attacked Israel over and over again. But Nasser is gone, and Sadat has taken over, and Sadat knows what it has cost Egypt in each of these attacks, because he, of course, was leading troops in these attacks, and does go ahead and sign a peace agreement with Israel that has held to this day. And it's really the only bedrock peace agreement that's out there. Also didn't mention Jonestown. What was it? And it's kind of the only reason I really mentioned it. That, of course, is where uh, you have this entire cult group that get together. Supposedly they're relinquishing all their worldly goods. They're really just turning them over to the head of the cult. But when a uh, a mother of a constituent, or a constituent worried about one of their child, is telling their congressman about that. The congressman shows up. He's shot at the landing strip in Guyana, and what actually happens then is, knowing that the troops will be coming after them, they all commit suicide, right? So kind of a big deal. Then also you have the San Francisco shooting, and of course that is at City Hall with board members, and it's now rather famous with Harvey Milk, first openly gay serving uh, uh, person in the supervisors there in San Francisco, and becomes a big deal. Love Canal, what's that about? That, of course, is all of the chemicals, dangerous chemicals, that had been dumped in an area that later turns out to be developed as a housing development. And when the kids and then the parents also are developing these diseases and cancers, they realize it's because of all these chemicals, and becomes one of the first efforts to go out and try and clean this up. It kind of awakens us to things. By the same token, the California Proposition 13, 78 is kind of a big year here, right? Proposition 13, again, that's an outgrowth of the populism movement, where they've put into effect in different states that you can have a referendum on the ballot that would allow you to change the state constitution. We saw it just last year with South Dakota as well, with the marijuana laws. But in the Proposition 13 is the one where Californians had felt they were being overly taxed, especially for education and things like that. So they rebelled, and they passed Proposition 13, which put a lid on the amount and percentage of taxes that can be put in place. And then, of course, we talked about this. The hostages were seized in Iran. 3 Mile Island, the nuclear accident that essentially has really stopped nuclear development of power plants. And that has a big deal. And of course, also, I kind of mentioned this in passing last week, the USSR invades Afghanistan. And why did they invade? What in the heck were they invading for? Remember that they're saying that they invaded, and at the time they said it was because of terrorism activity that's emanating from Afghanistan, which is rather ironic in retrospect now, because of course that is very much the reason we went in. But in December of 79, they really did it because a leader of Afghanistan was assassinated, and he was a pro-Soviet leader and was being replaced, and the USSR wanted to prevent the country from falling to non-communist. In other words, nobody at the Kremlin wanted to hear who lost Afghanistan. It's kind of interesting how these things work out, isn't it? So, all right. And then we saw Nixon resign, big event. Vietnam ends, Nixon departs, Ford trips, gasoline prices escalate, uh, because as we go on into these issues with Iran and the hostages and everything, they totally turn off the tap on the oil. So it's not just the turn down that we saw, but it's actually the embargo. And Carter fails. So just got to ask you, did anything good happen out of the 70s? And I should probably come up here. Yeah. And Sandy did ask, did any of the Jonestown cults survive? I believe a very few might have, but I'm not certain about that. I should check on that. Thank you for asking that. Music was really the biggest thing. And of course, the one point I'll say is that if you don't mention disco, I won't. But, entertainment throughout the 70s was pretty good. If you think about it, you had the Godfather movies that made a huge impact on people. You had, Star Wars, which is still going on today. You had a lot of big name movies. But for music, you had Led Zeppelin, you had Crosby, Stills, Nash, and or Young. You got this Bruce Springsteen guy who set the world on fire with this album. You got Fleetwood Mac, who again, broke through all barriers with the Rumors album. Tom Petty, one of my personal favorites, actually got me out to the record store. And of course, the Eagles with Hotel California. It was their last one. They were broken up and gone by the time it came out, but still. And then Michael Jackson launches his solo career. Can't be anything big with that, right? And as I said, you got Star Wars, and I don't know if you can see yourself in this line here, but some of them, some of you may have been standing in a line like that in May and June of 1977. Here are the positives that I'd like to mention that should have, that should be mentioned. We know that air and water pollution were rampant. I talked last week about my first visit to St. Louis and how terrible the air quality was and everything else. But essentially, the Clean Air and Clean Water Act passes, and that's kind of the first steps. We're becoming more conscious of what we've been doing in the world to the world. So you've got Earth Day and conservationism is actually coming to the fore, and that's a vitally important thing. And efforts are starting to clean up past problems, and part of that is the reality of knowledge that you've got those problems as identified by Love Canal. Remember, Sioux City ended up being a one of those sites that had to be cleaned up because for decades they would dump the fuel at the end of the runway, out at the 185th. So that all eventually had to come up because they did tests and they show, well, it's not like this dissipated, it's just down there and it kind of spreads and moves around as this big amount of dirt that's been hit. Now we also, I guess I'll just mention this, and I'm just going to throw this out there for what it's worth, but excuse me, very few people will tell you that Carter was a good president, and I'm not going to, because the guy did an immense, the things he got wrong big, but most of those were things about dealing with people. Again, not, if you think about it, what's a politician? Somebody who can get things that they want from multiple different groups and make all of them happy about it. That's a successful politician. Carter was anything but that, but he was very successful at what he did. I put here that Carter could be forgiven if he were to ask, what more did you want? Unemployment came down over his 4 years. The only escalation in inflation, he had actually followed the Fed's recommendations. He listened to the experts, i.e., the economists that said, if we're going to break this double-digit inflation, this is what we've got to do. And the only inflation during his time on the beat was those escalations due to energy crunches. And if you think about it, I'm just going to mention this. We had absurdly low, and I know this is ridiculous to say, but we had such low prices for our energy costs, i.e., our gasoline for cars, that there was no effort to make them fuel efficient. There was no effort to make them cleaner. Because we had no reason to. We had only barely, under the Clean Air Acts, actually started putting all that crud on top of your engine. And as somebody who worked on car engines back then, that stuff was pretty infuriating. But you get a little older and you understand why it's there. But he'd done all of those things, and he did what nobody else has managed to do before or since, really. He browbeat Congress into managing the cost. Remember, I said he had that midnight session where he dumped all of those pork barrel projects in Congress and just totally infuriated his own party. But I guess I will say to you, I really can't come up with a lot of proof that Carter was a Democrat. He ran on the Democratic ticket, but in reality, if you think about it, it's his own party that tries to dump him in those primaries come 1980 because they're not happy with him. Now, remember, I said he's done what nobody else decided to do. Remember, it's Congress that's forcing Clinton, but also that gives Clinton the tools to do what's right. And Clinton suddenly looks at it and does realize that the deficits need to be managed. So with that, Carter had done a lot of things. And as I said, he did something that nobody's done before or since. He's managed a lasting, real peace between two countries, that even though the people who signed that ended up out of favor or dead, because of course, realize that it cost Sadat his life to sign that on the anniversary of the Yom Kippur War. A few years later after this, he would be assassinated by his own army troops out of anger for having declared a peace with Israel. So also realize that you've got high amounts of unemployment coming into the 80s. So, okay. William tells us that only one woman survived the Jonestown massacre. So thank you, William. Okay. So what this chart, and I don't know why that didn't come out very large. I'll have to change that. But notice during the Reagan recession, we will hit double-digit unemployment. We were very close to double-digit unemployment under Ford as well. So 9% and then 10%, that's pretty big. But you can also see that the things that Carter did actually had meaning, because after you got past those high energy cost spikes and you're starting to manage it, all of the runaway inflationary effects are taken out following into the 80s. And remember what I said, he'd slashed it in a midnight budget. So here's Carter, who is not beloved by his party in any way, shape, or form. And he really was a populist more than a Democrat. And the biggest thing he was an outsider. And there's another outsider running to replace him, because remember, Ronald Reagan was not a mainstream Republican. They really did not want him as their standard bearer. This guy made his name by promoting the person that had taken them to the worst drubbing since Hoover, and that was Goldwater. But Reagan is coming on and they can't stop him. And remember, that's also why Anderson runs as a third party person against Reagan come the 1980 election. So, not that it had any impact at all. But Reagan had never been an insider with the GOP. Both he and Carter are outsiders, and that is a point that I'm trying to make here. People are starting to ideas and thoughts and everything else among the populace is starting to spread apart. We come out of the 50s, really, I kept talking about how, if you were young and, to be blunt, white, you experienced the 50s very much in the same way. Even those of us in rural areas have some shared experiences with the people in the cities. Mainly because we had all of the same entertainments, all of the same opportunities on those levels, the same things interested us. But remember, all the marketing that I talked about was aimed at us. It gave us that shared experience. But every decade that goes on, it's spreading farther and further apart. While at the same time, we're also trying to make sure that everybody, even those disparate groups, have some value. Now, here's another thing we need to remember, and I'm hoping somebody will remind me of this a little later, but one of the things about Reagan is he came from our region out here in the countryside. And remember, at his age, when he was young, there were a number of religions that were not quite settled, and you had people that came around for revivals and camp meetings and everything else and spoke greatly and from the heart about religion. And one of the things, if you think back to Reagan's era of his time, he does that a lot. He talks about the city on the hill being the example. All of this, of course, is very grounded in the religious nature of the Protestants of the plains regions. And that language, that feeling, and that openness, that while he does not talk about his religion, he does exert that feeling, and he makes it clear to them those are the people he's trying to reach. Now, here's a reality that we need to understand, is that Reagan does not really invite those people into the tent. But what is going to happen in the post-Reagan years is the religious groups will, have become active and will be doing that. So now, again, getting back into music, remember I said it's almost like it's a passing of not quite generational for music, but as we're coming into the 80s, late 79 and 80, here's the Clash with London Calling, and rock and roll going back to its original, what are you rebelling against? What do you got? And the Clash are certainly that. On the other hand, you've got people that, they're speaking to the public who's feeling like they're being treated like just another brick in the wall. On another hand, though, you've got some people that are just dropping it out, and they're dropping out and moving away and playing at a piano bar in California. Man, what are you doing here? Billy Joel making his step forward in the late 70s. And of course, this guy who will set the music world on fire with, as he goes solo from his 4 siblings out of the Jackson 5. Now, Reagan has become president. We're not going to go deeply into his presidency, but to understand the impact, as I said, here he is speaking to people, and he moves people when he speaks. And he does that very well with both sides of the fence on the party. And unlike Carter, who ran as an outsider and then lived as an outsider, froze the politicians out, literally, insulted Tip O'Neill frequently, who's the House leader. Reagan cultivates him. And of course, Tip is cultivating Reagan because, Tip really doesn't care who gets the credit for what, it's who gets the money back home. You remember, Tip O'Neill is the guy who said very famously, all politics are local. and meaning, what'd you do for your constituents? Because that's what they're going to remember come vote time. So he tells Reagan, we can do business, and boy, do they do business. Now, of course, it almost doesn't happen. Remember, during the election, here's Reagan. He's an old man as far as all the baby boomers are concerned. A lot of jokes about that. He's going to be the oldest president ever if he gets elected, and he does. So there were the sardonic bumper stickers that had been put out. And I was looking at one the day I'm listening to the radio to hear that Reagan has been shot. And that bumper sticker on the car in front of me was that one that had gotten passed out as an anti-Reagan one. It's Reagan in 80, Bush in 81, because of course Bush was his vice president. And it almost came to pass. And of course, 2 police officers and his press secretary were critically wounded in this. But luck is on Reagan's side. He makes a full recovery. And of course, he's wisecracking through the emergency room, which at the time annoyed me greatly, because I'm like, how can you do that? You've got people grieving for these, other people who are in serious surgeries, and then come to realize he had never been informed while he was in surgery with what was happening. Now, remember, we're also finally returning to space. And you may all remember, we came out of space in a big way, right? Because we had that beautiful Skylab up there, but well, we didn't have anything to take it back to a higher orbit, and the orbit keeps declining. So it comes down. You remember the Skylab parties? Do you remember? I think it was like Ninth and Jones, that some wit went out and painted concentric circles around the manhole cover there at the intersection, and then wrote Skylab here, because if you looked at it at a distance, it looked like a target. We were having, all the bets as to where it was going to come down at. Pretty big piece of equipment to come down. But we're aiming high in 81. We're going back into space. But in reality, what we don't get, we're very excited about it off the start, but it becomes ho-hum very quickly, because in reality, what we did was we created a truck. We were just putting the satellites in the truck and sending it up, and then you deliver the satellites into their low orbit and go on. But that orbit, it was very exciting. But remember, those satellites are doing something, and they're changing things as well, because satellites are how we're getting delivery of television, and that is how we are getting delivery of cable television. Remember, cable originally in South Sioux, perfect example, they put up a big antenna. That's what it was. Cable television stood for community antenna, CATV, community antenna television, because a lot of places didn't have much and we're a good example. They put a 500-foot tower out here in South Sioux, and you got Omaha, Sioux Falls, and Sioux City. Woo, you got lots of choices. They're mostly the same, but during the day, during the non-network time, you got a lot. But of course, WTBS, it was WGNB or something like that originally, becomes the first superstation. It has the reach of a network like ABC. I think it actually beat ABC for number of places that could see it. And thus, all of a sudden, you've got a counter voice available to network. And that's going to become more and more prevalent. At the time Sioux City got cable TV, they realized this was coming, even though it hadn't kicked off yet. There was only the superstation, but as laws were changing, you would get things like ESPN, you would get C-SPAN, and of course you'd get your, in time for the 1980 elections, you'd get your CNN, the news network, first news network, and most people didn't think anybody had really listened to it. So again, you've got competition coming in, and of course, things are changing all over. Walter Cronkite's leaving, but some things don't change. You've got that us-them reaction between the Soviets and the Americans. And when a Korean jetliner goes off course, even though their pilots are telling them it's a jetliner, they're ordered to shoot it down, and they do. And of course, all 265 people on it are dead, including at least one US congressman who happened to be on it. The Soviets will not hear the end of that for quite a while, but we've got bigger things going on because we've moved to reassert ourselves into the world. We kind of pulled back after Vietnam. I called it the Vietnam syndrome. Reagan is saying, no, we're gonna keep being out there, and we send Marines into Beirut. But the problem is, of course, Beirut is under a bitter civil war. It's house to house, block to block fighting in Beirut, which had been the jewel of the of the Middle East, and now it's a mess. But as we move in, there are those who don't want us there, and there is a suicide bombing in Lebanon, and they also attack the Italians, I think, and the French at the same time. But I think ours is the most devastating because they break through the barriers. No one really thought about suicide bombers in a truck like that. And Reagan's going to have to announce that. And it's rather interesting because, of course, everybody knew about it. He doesn't address it right away because remember, one of Reagan's thing is he doesn't want another Cuba. He doesn't want, he's following that concept of we don't want communism in the Western hemisphere. And he can't do anything about Cuba, but by gosh, the little island of Grenada is going to have a visit. And it had been taken as a joke. I was listening to a news report where the head ambassador of Grenada is saying there is an invasion force steaming toward us right now on a live news program. It was an NPR program, and they're I can't remember if it was Noah Adams or Ira Glass that was saying, nah, yeah, that's hilarious. Most Americans don't even know where Grenada is, but then wake up the next morning and they had done it. Rescuing 1,000 medical students who really weren't aware that they needed rescuing, as I like to say. But it's the first military action since Vietnam. It's very popular, and Reagan would go on the air to announce both it and the Beirut barracks bombing at the same time. Now, also another thing coming up is the Strategic Defense Initiative, which gets renamed Star Wars, of course, and that's where we're going to supposedly put satellites up that can shoot down incoming missiles. And the technology didn't exist. It still doesn't exist today, but it was a great ploy, and certainly caused the Russians a great deal of consternation. And I should say the Soviets. But now, remember, last week I'd shown you this cover of Newsweek. Women are in revolt. They're taking over. They're moving into the workforce. Well, we need to think about this. Here's the 1980s. They are definitely moving into the workforce, but they're finding out that they can't dump their work at home either. They do not have the same capability that most men have, where they either do not have children that they're the primary caregiver for, or the responsibilities for anybody else. So women moving into that workforce are finding things are a little different. But I've talked about this and the fact that one of the reasons that wages went down and unemployment kind of went up is because women were moving into the workforce in force. And in 1950, not even 30% of the women worked outside the home. And of course, that escalates quickly. And really, by 1980, they're almost approaching 40%, and it will continue. But here's the other thing to remember, and I've said this to you before, a big issue is the fact that women are outpacing men. They have been for a number of years by this point, but they're outpacing men in college education. So they are moving into the workforce, but they're not necessarily satisfied to move into the workforce simply as a clerk. So now it may start out they're just office managers. And remember also that in the 1980s, this new thing called HR is being formed in most workforces. And that human resource really is aimed at the fact that the workplace is really, really different now that you have two genders involved in an equal capacity in some cases, or more incredibly, in a capacity that says maybe that woman's going to be this man's boss. And I know I'm pretty sure I've told you this story once before, but I will just mention it. I will never forget. I think it was 1980, might have been 1981. I'm working with a lot of cool equipment. Of course, I can name the computers that they're working with right there, but I'm working with a lot of cool equipment. And there's somebody standing there. And this guy and I that work together are talking to this person. And the guy is looking at it and said, wow, this is so incredible. It's so cool. I got to ask, though, what's it like working with? And I'm thinking they're going to say, this editor, this such and such, this piece of equipment, all of these things that we're working with because we're standing there surrounded by all this equipment. And the guy finishes up with, for a woman. And I'm just kind of like, because it hadn't occurred to me. I mean, it really didn't make a difference to me. I really didn't think about it in those terms. And I'm about to say that when the guy I work with, who's standing right beside me, goes, oh, let me tell you, and goes on chapter and verse about all these problems. I won't say grievances, but he treats them almost as though they are working for a woman. And it's like, I'm just in awe. I'm just kind of listening to this because it never had occurred to me. But the point is, that time is coming, and really and truly, even as they cross that 40% line, many of them are moving into the workforce, and they're moving into the workforce in a supervisory capacity. Now, in the early days, they might be limited supervising mostly other women, but that changes very quickly. Now, the other thing that changes with that is we're seeing a difference in the way women are being approached by advertising. They're suddenly starting to be treated like they are professionals. And, you start seeing them not in aprons, not in these other things, but in the magazines, you're seeing them, marketed to as professionals. And that's kind of a big thing. But big things are changing. Reagan puts a woman on the Supreme Court. What a concept. Just a few years before that, there had been this entire movie kind of talking, and Walter Matthau is in it, talking about how strange that's going to be. And of course, putting Walter Matthau as this guy that's going to be pushing back against this concept, which happens a lot in real life. But a woman is placed in nomination and is placed on the Supreme Court, and it's a big day. Although it says here reaction is mixed. Wonder what that means. Well, women's roles versus social norms. Oh my gosh, reports looking at three major issues: matter of flexible work hours, whether it's family oriented in the 50s and now suddenly it's not. And oh my gosh, we've really got to think about this. And remember, this is one of the reasons I said we have a growth of HR departments. And of course, I will tell you, as somebody who came up and was managing, I did have a little difficulty with some HR departments, just simply in the fact that, at this time in business, you started at the bottom and worked your way up to the top. And to get to each level beyond that, working toward the top, each level beyond that entry level, you basically had to know everybody else's job that you were going to manage, and you kept going up that way. That was how the ladder worked. But of course, there were a great many people who were coming out of college, moving into these businesses, and that's not where they started, because they were moving into a supervisory position for clerks, or into the HR department. And that was changing how work worked as well, how those businesses worked. So not only do you have changes just in the character nature between genders, between those women roles and social norms, but also just in how the expectation of that latter works in business at this point. And Iowa finds itself on the front lines here in Sioux City. A woman who had just had her third child, is not really happy with the idea that her choices could be, being a cleaner or a server. And she says, there's an opening in the fire department. I'm going for it. Now it's a physical job, but she says she's always been a tomboy, and she steps into it. And this, I'm thinking just a few years ago, she had retired after making it all the way. And in her retirement and in the interviews, she talks about, she got pushback. She got a lot of pushback, but she stepped up and pushed back herself, pushed through. And she would talk about the fact that 10 years after she had gotten there, one of the supervisors who had pushed pretty hard trying to keep her down or out said, I only did that because I really didn't think you were capable of it. And I have to tell you, you have done a good job, and I've come to respect you and what you've done. And, she found that heartwarming, but also think about the fact 10 years to get this person's respect. That's kind of says a lot right there. Now, she just passed on recently, but then I want you to think about Iowa made waves because I think it was in Iowa City that a woman, much like this woman, did go in, did get the job, but then the roof came off the fire department because she too was a young mother and wanted to be able, expected to be able to nurse her youngest child at the fire department, because of course they had at that time X number of days on and X number of days off, so you could be ready for a fire at any moment. And her coworkers were just scandalized and outraged by this, and it went through the courts to allow her to stay. Now, that's not this woman, that's in Iowa City, but the point is, it is very similar. It's a change. And one of the things people just don't like is change. And that's a lot of what we're dealing with in so much of this. Now, I will just say, it's time for out with the old. Big thing in the 1980s for Sioux City. We need to, since we were looking there at home, let's look at a few other things. April 17th, 1981. And I need to mention this, by the way, because they're, what are they going to do? They're going to blow away on April 17th the old, what we called the Combination Bridge. But I'll just mention, looking back, I was struck by the South Bridge, the Veteran Memorial Bridge that's down there, takes Highway 20 and connects. That bridge opened today in 1976. It was November 22nd, 1976, 45 years ago, I think. Pretty impressive. It's still standing, although it's all year. We've only had one lane in each direction, but now, anyway. And just some names we should remember: Connie Bodine, Lauren Callender, Courier Holman, of course, for business. That's the IBP side, and Ted Waite, a relative of his who uses some of that money to create something called Gateway 2000. And why is it called Gateway? Because he's at one of the unused hangars at the Gateway Airport. We'll talk a little bit more about him, but that's for the 20th. And remember, I said Sioux City had gone through urban renewal. They'd torn down a lot of places. One of the things people were saying is, oh, they the people want to be able to just walk back and forth. And much like an indoor mall, what we're going to do is we're going to close 4th Street so it's easy to cross back and forth. And I'm sorry, some of you probably know the name of it. A friend of mine worked on this. Her name was Nancy Lee Zizi, but they'd been asked, saying, "Oh, they want to make it a friendly area, so we're going to shut off this roadway." And where they'd built the Hilton and the new theaters, they didn't have a road through there originally, and made it a permanent walk across mall. Same thing here. They wanted to take the road out of it, and you could just walk back and forth, so no car traffic. But they said it's just going to be temporary until we build the big one. And she used to laugh at it because it lasted for far more years, 4 or 5 years, as a temporary mall. But remember, Sioux City was, taking part in that thing. Remember, I said how this all came together. Those funds for urban renewal that Sioux City cashed in on, that was part of the effort to end urban blight, the downtown blight, which was felt that's where a lot of the problems were coming in with the rioting, because Black people were stuck in these urban centers. They were decaying, they were going bad, and thus they were a tinderbox for sparks of a social nature. So Sioux City had embraced that. They tore down lots of buildings and everything else. And one of them they knocked down was at 4th and Nebraska, and they Brandeis department store was coming in. It was going to be a multi-store indoor big building, kind of like a mini mall. There was one like it in Omaha downtown, and Brandeis was going to do that. They were going to make this happen, and we ended up with Lake Brandeis because they backed out, right? So here is what the developer said it was going to look like. But you'll be happy to know in December of 1980, Sioux City gets a contract. Somebody is finally going to fill that hole. It's been there for a number of years at this point, and that's how it got the nickname Lake Brandeis, because it filled with water. And then eventually they put a fence around it to keep people from drowning in it if they're messing around. And it's going to be a tower. They're going to build a tower there, an elegant tower. It's going to be all glass and mirror surface. And Terra Chemical is going to make their home office there. They'll be all under one roof. And they do. It takes quite a while after this, 2 or 3 years, but they do get it. And of course, part of this is the hospital up is going to build across the street, build a hospital there, connect them by a skywalk, etc. So, and there are those theaters, still beautiful, still nice oh, that's right, they're closed now. But anyway, they'd had to put that in because they'd knocked down the Capitol, they'd knocked down the Hollywood. So here was the Riviera. But we still had, it was okay, we still had the Gordon 2 drive-in. And I, of course, right here on my desk, I have a newer picture from the early 80s. It closed in 85, but I'm sure you, like me, saw many movies at the Gordon Twin, right down where Fairway is at, for those of you who aren't familiar with it. But of course, we had other theaters downtown that had avoided getting knocked down, and that was, remember, one of the other changes was freedom of speech, and things that had been formally declared pornographic would be freedom of speech. So yes, Mayfair Hotel and the Sioux City Crockery were the ones demolished, which made the Brandeis hole. Yeah. And in reality, they also took out what at the time they moved somewhere else. They moved into the old Montgomery Ward's building, but the Sioux City Stationery had been right there beside the Badgerow building as well, too. So it is a changing time, and not everybody is comfortable with all this change. And of course, you've got, a lot of things that nobody could imagine 10 or 15 years prior to that. And if you went to a big city, you saw that a lot. But the other things you saw in a big city was malls, actual malls. And Sioux City had fought 8 years to keep a shopping mall out. Sioux Falls, of course, embraced them, and therein hangs a tale. But the Southern Hills Mall would open on the March 5th of 1980. And so last year was its 40th anniversary, and of course, with COVID and all the other things that have beset malls, it almost passed into receivership, but I believe they have overcome that. But the Southern Hills Mall opened. Why did Sioux City fight it? They had embraced that downtown redevelopment. And they knew, and they were absolutely right, that once you did put a mall out there, a lot of your businesses downtown would flock to that. Now, remember, all we had was Sunset Plaza before this. We had Bellis S. Of course, Bellis S would be driven out when 75 decided to go 4-lane. And they ended up closing that entire road for so many months, stretching into a year, and Bellis S just went belly up. But anyway, what's at a mall? Well, of course, as we all remember, when they opened it, 14 shoe stores, but there was this new thing called an arcade. What's an arcade? All those electronic games that had replaced the idea of pinball machines. They're electronic, they're based on computers. That's one of those new things. We saw the computers in those pictures for the businesses. Well, there's computers in these arcades, and in a quarter a shot, you could become an expert at that. Or if you paid money up front, it wasn't quite as popular, but you could go to a place like this, which was also in the mall, and pick up something that looked like this and learn how to program those computers so that you could build them. The vast difference, there might be one or two people hanging around Radio Shack to look at one of these versus the 100 or so down at the other end for the arcade. But hey, to each his own. So and I did make the joke about the fact you couldn't hook this up. Well, you could. You if you had the RS-232, you could get online with it. But anyway, other changes. They'd built that new bridge, and they were, as I said, they were going to knock down the one that had stood for 80 years, to replace it, and all that is happening. And of course, for those of you who remember, it's April 17th. They were replacing the bridge because, of course, it was unsafe and it wasn't going to stand. So they put all the dynamite on it, and they ignited it. And this is, St. Patrick's Day in 1981. And of course, the bridge just goes groan. And they had to go and do it all again because the bridge did not fall down when they detonated all that dynamite. So, but it's 1981, August 1st, and we have MTV launching. Is this exciting or what? So with MTV, and I put it down, it's the day the music changed. And we all know that their first song was the Buggles, a British group that had come out with a song a year or two before. The video killed the radio store. But the second video was a newcomer that we had not really heard of before, Pat Benatar. And I think it was You Better Run, which I'm thinking was an old, was it Rascals song? But they, she and her group, she'd been classically trained, but she had an incredible voice, and they would go on to own the world. And this is another place where we're seeing a big change when video comes in. Whereas prior to this, you had occasional individual singers, and only rarely did you have the situation like Jefferson Airplane with a strong female lead that was really nearly in charge. Here we're starting to see the rise of women in this, but MTV becomes a very big deal. And the reason MTV becomes such a big deal is because it does something that nobody else has been doing for 5 or 6 years, especially the radio stations. Instantly upon its launch, it's selling albums. And those albums are making a big deal. Those sales are incredible. And, so Benatar and Chrissy Hind with the Pretenders, these people are going to leap to the forefront. Um, but one's going to go past all of them, and her name is Madonna. She is just, just an individual act. But, the interesting thing is she not only goes so much further, it is joked very early on that she's almost the equivalent of the Beatles, but in a single person, in the fact that she is very astute with the use of her money and her clout and her power. And really, it's joked that by the age of 40, um, they're realizing she's going to own the entire music industry if she wants to. But of course, that makes sense because, well, she is a material girl. But, a lot of clever talent, a lot more than what she seems to be. And she does very, very well. There's also that, she takes the dancing aspects of disco and moves it into music with a pretty powerful voice. So she does incredibly well, and really only stops short of controlling everything because she didn't want to. Um, but remember, this is a time for entertainment. And there's a lot of incredible movies out there. As you saw there, Top Gun, Raiders of the Lost Ark, these are movies, the Die Hard movies that are really making a big deal. Of course, you had Pretty in Pink, The Breakfast Club with the Brat Pack, as they called them. You got Flashdance. You've got so many, and you've got the combination of action movies and entertainment movies, singing and dancing and things like that. But here's the thing: there's also a message that comes clear. These are not the movie, even their entertainment movies with all the music. These are not the beach blanket bingos, and these are not the hippies of the at the end of the 60s. Every one of these groups, every one of these people make it clear they're in it for the cash. When it comes to the entertainment side of it, not so much the action movies, but I'm talking about the Pretty in Pink. They have a message in there, and it can be a heavy message. Fast Times at Ridgemount High and things like that. They're aimed at youth, but they can be a pretty heavy message. Well, there's also the movies that put out the message "Greed is Good" from Wall Street, 1987. That's Michael Douglas there, but it's part of what we were seeing, and that goes back to that deadhead sticker on a Cadillac. Fun is good, but so's money. Money is really good. So with all of that, that kind of becomes the note for a lot of the 80s, because remember what else has happened. Reagan has also put out his his tax cut plan and succeeds at it, where he takes the high income bracket down about I'm thinking 12 or 14 points. And of course, remember, Nebraska had some very poor uh, members of Congress, but they were there for a long time, so they got high seniority and were in places, and they weren't terrible. They always made the top of at least two lists, least effective and worst dressed. But one of them on the tax committee came to Reagan and tried to explain to him, you can't take taxes down like that. You had to work to get them to this level, because the one thing that happens is once you take a tax away, it is harder than heck to bring it back. And if you bring it down, just moving it up a point is hard. If you take it down 12, 14 points, that's going to be catastrophic. And Reagan was good. I want to starve government. That's an important thing. So we'll talk more about that. But that greed, hey, my money, I get to keep my money. It's an understandable concept, but there's also issues about. I also like my streets plowed. I also like a police force. I also like a fire department. So these things are all pretty important things. And especially if you think about it, Reagan has a doctrine that's saying we're going to add covert aid to any anti-communist resistance movement. Now, we've just said one of the populist issues is we don't want to be, and we still hear it today, I don't want to be the world's policeman. But, well, no, this is self-defense. We're anti-communism, and communism is gonna be bad for us. But he also is, of course, spending additional money on the military because, of course, he's using it again, and additional covert operations. Reagan was very big, much like Ike, very big into the covert operations because you can do it on the cheap, is the thought. Really and truly, there's nothing cheap about it, but compared to you're limiting the number of lives. One of the reasons Ike liked it a lot. And also, you do it in secret. You don't have to justify it really to hardly anybody. That actually is that dangerous, slippery slope that I would like to keep everybody's mind on. Remember, he had already embraced the Grenada, the Operation Urgent Fury bombing Libya, the other pieces. And Reagan had put in place a CIA director that, was, hey, anything you want, we'll make it happen. Now, of course, the CIA has always been very big at promising a lot and maybe not doing much. And of course, the FBI has that problem too. And that frustrates presidents that just say, oh, I want to make this happen. But I guess one of the things I'd like everybody to think about is I would like to weigh 100 pounds less and be 21 again. But, that doesn't, doesn't really happen without a lot of effort. Now, Casey goes along with everything that President Reagan wants to do. And that leads us into a lot of odd schemes that include bringing drugs into America, pumping drugs into other countries, and also putting our armed forces on the ground in a lot of South American countries that nobody knows were there to interdict the drug trade. And because those countries are feeling the pressure of these this is where the word cartels start to come in, where these drug lords are becoming a threat to the local countries, they're very happy to ask. First, the U.S., is flying patrols along the coast of those countries trying to stop smugglers, but then we're actually putting some troops on the ground there. So much is going on. And of course, none of it's authorized by anybody but the president saying, I want this. But of course, Casey is keeping the president's name out of it. Casey will go on. So much of this stuff that was going on was extra legal, outside what was legal. And Bob Woodward, of course, is tracing some of this down, and he's trying to get Casey to confirm some of it. Casey's on his deathbed, and Bob Woodward tells him that, he goes, come on, you want the world to know, tell us the history so at least the history books can get it right and we can look back on this. And Casey, according to Bob Woodward, Casey tells him, yeah, I all of this was on the president's authorization, and then smiles at him and says, and now I dare you to prove it. And of course, Casey will die very shortly. He's on his deathbed and he knows that. And Casey's family says, oh, he wasn't even communicative at that point. Casey couldn't have told him that. So Casey, holds the president's secrets all the way to his death. And, I guess you can say there's good and bad about that, because Reagan, like JFK, like Ike, like a lot of others, pushed that agency. Reagan not only wanted to hold down the concept of communists moving into the region, he also, had the idea of he wanted to free the hostages and makes a big deal about that. Now, what is not clear is whether or not this guy is acting on orders from Reagan or just goes beyond it, but he's a member of the National Security Council. Actually, his boss is on the Security Council, Poindexter. Um, but North says, yeah, we can make that happen. And what they end up doing is they start making arms deals because they want to have influence with this new group that's coming along over there. They'd like to get back in with Iran. They'd like to have some pressure, some leverage to try and get those guys, those hostages freed. So they're dealing with this group called Hezbollah, which we didn't know their name at that time, but of course they've gone on to be one of those groups that would frequently use, I don't know, missiles and things against Israel. But that's who they're dealing with, and they're supplying them with tow missiles. They're supplying them with other items. And Reagan has always said that he was definitely anti trading for hostages, but got to remember, he's also anti-communist, and there's a communist government that's been installed in Nicaragua. They've deposed the dictator Somoza, and senior officials are, trying to figure out how to make this work to get money to them. And you've got to remember, Congress doesn't want anything to do with this. Congress has just survived the idea of, all that we went through with Vietnam. They do not want another Gulf of Tonkin situation where they're going to get sucked into yet again somebody else's civil war. And so they pass laws that say, you can't supply Nicaragua, either side, with anything, period. And Congress has the right to make those laws, and they are binding on the president. Here's the problem with having secret groups. You don't have insight. And to be honest, you don't know if even the president has insight into what they're doing. There's no overview. There's no way to understand what exactly they've done. And of course, this is where the problem with having a true believer about, a vehement anti-communist or whatever, a vehement, hey, whatever my president says, that's what I want. We get into that issue of who will rid me of this troublesome priest, who will rid me of this troublesome Nicaragua issue, this Daniel Ortega. And Oliver North comes up with this clever scheme that says, hey, we're selling all these weapons over here. And since nobody knows we're selling it, nobody knows we've got this money. And let's take the money and buy other arms and send it to Nicaragua. Now, clearly there's a problem with this. It kind of circumvents American, Congress and the law. But, he's citing to the CIA, hey, Reagan wants these hostages taken care of. Reagan also wants, this communist regime taken care of. We need to do this. And he's putting himself in the place saying, well, I've got a source, I've got intel. But of course, the CIA felt that his contact over in Iran was totally bogus, and it would turn out to be that way. But the CIA also covers their bases and helps him out. Now, the problem with all this is, where they need the CIA's help is transportation and things that they can provide, and they do so. So you've got now missiles and arms going into the tinderbox known as the Middle East, and you've got arms and weapons coming back to a country where you've got roving bands in Nicaragua on both sides of the groups that are murdering and raping people that aren't part of their side, whichever side that is. And of course, you've got those tragic incidents that we read about with, the Somoza side that are, killing priests and nuns and things like that. So I mean, there's so much that says really we should just stay out of this. But one of the problems is, again, secret groups, you don't know. Now, Reagan, of course, is very busy at this time. He and Gorbachev meet in Geneva and they find that they have a rapport. And while they debate and debate strongly, it gives them a respect for each other. And they both have the same feeling that international issues of grave importance need to be taken care of. And it's not so much a we win, you lose type situation. There's some work back and forth. But remember, in all this, we also have, as I said, we've taken this for granted after 50 flights. Really and truly, they'd never expected all these shuttles to do all that much. And the Space Shuttle Challenger lifts off on what seems to be yet another normal thing. In fact, it's become so normal that they brought a school teacher along, and 4 minutes after liftoff, it explodes on nationwide TV. We're watching, and Reagan, in one of his finest moments, provides a 4 minute speech, which, in my mind, honestly, probably ranks up there. Maybe not in the heft of it, but in the connection it makes with the Gettysburg Address. And of course, we all know the famous line is, "Slip the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God." And of course, you feel it. You feel it when he says it. You feel it when you watch him, but you feel that way with him anyway. And we'll talk about that toward the end of it. Now, something behind the scenes that I might have mentioned in our other class on Reagan earlier this year, and I'm only spending as much time with Reagan because so much, we've got the entertainment side driving a lot of the things, but we've talked about that. We've talked about the change in the workforce. We've talked about women moving into the workforce, but a lot of these things that Reagan is doing is also affecting and impacting a lot of things. So we're talking more about him than we did about the other presidents. But one of the things I'll just mention, after this explosion, Reagan makes some very key decisions. He had delayed the State of the Union to give this address that night to talk to the American people, but he also goes to NASA and says, let's get to the bottom of this and find out what's really going on. Will take the delays. He delegated George Bush, his vice president, to go down there to talk to the families. And he's working closely with NASA. I mean, what it does show is Reagan is willing to change course when necessary and when needed, and knows how to delegate. He does a very, he and I'm giving him his due. You heard me knock Carter for the fact that things Carter could not do. Reagan, like Bill Clinton afterwards, can rise to the moment and provide solace to the American public and connect and communicate with them in a way that so many presidents never could and never will. Now, Reagan and Gorbachev get back together again, and by this time they are really on fire about these issues. They are truly moving toward a concept of, disarmament. And, they make a first step that really puts the arms race down a notch. Now, part of this is where you also know that Reagan is not, one of the things with Carter, one of the things with Nixon, one of the things with Johnson or with Kennedy, these are guys that knew every moment of every detail of every item of what they were dealing with. They were deep studies. Reagan, not so much. Reagan is always about, let's put the right people in the room, find out what you need, make the deal, and get moving on. Reagan at one point offers to let's just take all of these weapons out there, and of course the staff has to come forward and explain to him, "No, you can't do that. We need them because they have a lot more troops than we have, and we'll always have access to more troops." So, but it's still a big stroke, because you got to remember at this point there were a lot of peace groups out there because Congress had never signed the SALT II treaty, the Strategic Arms Limitation Talk II, that Ford and Carter had worked on. So, these are big things and big issues, and it's really good that they're out there pulling those together. But the lid's about to come off the Iran-Contra affair because in November of 86, a plane crashes and it's stuffed with money and arms, and the news media is on the trail, and they will follow it because they can tell when it's money and arms. There's one obvious place to look, and the CIA, who had gone along with being the taxi provider to North, of course, they know what happened to them in the 70s after having gone along with some of the crazy schemes of Bobby Kennedy trying to come up with a way to get rid of Fidel Castro. They don't want to be they don't want their neck stuck out there, and they make it very clear, and they basically just empty the bag and say, no, we had nothing to do with this, go talk to this guy. And this guy will go on TV for a couple of weeks, and it's one of the reasons we're talking about this so much. This becomes kind of a pivotal moment. There's a couple of things that happen in front of Congress. We saw it with Watergate, and now we're seeing it with this, and we're going to see it again with a Supreme Court set of hearings. But the reality is, you've got someone that can sit in front of TV and put out their reasoning and their thoughts. And remember what I've said, as baby boomers, we might have all come along and had a large sharing of agreement. But at this point, as we've reached adulthood, there are going to again be those people that say, but wait a minute, we're not the world's policeman. And, the president has told us that, he's not in it for, he's never going to trade arms for hostages. And the Congress has told us we cannot do these certain things. And God help us, we don't want to have to say to the president, did you violate your oath of office? Remember, I will uphold the Constitution and the laws of the United States. That's kind of all elected officials at all levels have to make that pledge. And if you're violating congressional orders, you are not upholding the laws, of the United States. So everybody likes Reagan a lot, but this is kind of worrisome. How far does this go? It becomes the Watergate question. What did they know? When did they know it? And North, once he, makes the agreements to get immunity, and of course, Congress is saying, we're going to give you immunity so you can rat out all the others. And of course, North gets up there and says, okay, I'll make that deal. I'll give me the immunity and we'll do this. And North, of course, comes in there, empties the whole bag, tells them everything, but is telling them, I did it all myself. This was me. Nobody else was involved. The president didn't know. Nobody else knew. And in fact, you got to remember, at the exact same time that Oliver North, is making these statements, his boss, Poindexter, is at home taking an overdose of sleeping pills, trying to commit suicide so that he doesn't have to come in and make statements that might get Reagan into hot water as well. They'd taken the money from selling the missiles, given them to the terrorists, and the idea that they'd free hostages. And of course, there was not one hostage freed. There's also some question of that, because back when they hatched this idea, Hezbollah didn't have any hostages. So, but he goes on the record unequivocally that the president had no knowledge. And the first Tower report, which is a friendly report, Tower is big name at that time in Congress, but also a friend. And he comes out, the president had no prior knowledge of the action, and goes on to say there's some bad problems with it. But the congressional report itself goes even further and says, but if the president didn't know what his national security advisors were doing, he should have. That's a boss. That's what they do. Remember what I said. This is where you get into trouble, when you get into covert groups. Here's the other thing. The intelligence community as a whole did not like this, because remember, the NSA, National Security Agency, was set up by Truman and by Congress to provide that support to say, yeah, there's lots of people, the defense departments, each of the militaries, all these guys prior to this, plus the intelligence agencies were dumping these massive amounts of information on the president. No way anybody could actually do that. I want one source, said Truman. I want one source. You guys boil it down and tell me this is what I need to know. And in reality, nobody ever imagined that the guys who were there to hear all this and to talk about it and to say, we think that's important, we think that isn't, nobody in their right mind ever thought that those guys would actually get in the business of covert operations by themselves. That's what the CIA does. And there's an entire oversight mechanism for how you decide whether or not you're doing a covert operation. Oliver North, is just this guy. And, so you will start hearing in the news the question of whether he went rogue. And that's, of course, other intelligence groups saying he went rogue, went outside the boundaries, or went operational, or was asked to go operational. That becomes the big question. How much did the president know and when did he know it? But, Oliver North is very convincing. He even takes you to his garage where he shows you, yeah, well, you're looking for documents. You're not going to find any because, of course, I found every document that I could find. We shredded along with one heck of a lot of cash. And they've still got the bags, but of course, they were very efficient shredders. And he and his secretary had done a very good job of getting rid of any evidence that could say whether or not the president, or even if, and I'm willing to give Reagan the benefit of the doubt, clearly that he did not know. But the question is, who in his circle of cabinet members knew? And of course, that becomes a big issue because one of those, his vice president's going to run for president in 1988. Now, 14 indictments are handed out to his staff, 11 convictions. 4 of those convictions will be on CIA guys who had helped North do this. North, who's convicted, is going to have those convictions overturned, even though, except for the fact they were convicted, everything he got was, a fine, a prison sentence. The prison sentence was held as long as he completed probation. Probation was all of 1,200 hours of community service. But he'll get all those overturned because the ACLU would step forward and say, hey, guys, look, you gave him this and he spoke for 2 weeks on the air. You try and show me that you could find a jury that wasn't tainted knowing that he said he did this. So both North and Poindexter would have their sentences overturned. Now, I'm saying all this because, again, this has a big bearing on America, because the most popular president we've had since, really and truly since JFK suddenly takes a drop, from 67% to 46% in less than a week. Because the question is, he's gone on and told us repeatedly that they're not doing this stuff, and then it comes out they are. And he orders his own, we saw the Tower report, we saw the congressional inquiry. He then goes and orders his own investigation to find out what happened. And eventually, now he still is going on TV through part of this and saying, we didn't do what they said we did. We're not having anything to do with it. But of course, after Ollie North, he's actually kind of forced to look at this. And when he finally gets the report, he will actually go on TV. What began as a strategic opening to Iran deteriorated, and its implementation turned into trading arms for hostages. Now, Reagan being Reagan, he's able to do this, and he basically just comes out and says, the reason I haven't spoken to you about this before now is, deserve the truth. And frustrating as I'm sure waiting was, I felt it was improper to come to you with a sketchy report, or even possibly what would end up being an erroneous statement, which actually he had done, which would then have to be corrected, creating even more doubt and confusion. Well, of course, that's what happened in Watergate, right? You'd constantly be getting a new report or a new bit of fact that would overturn everything that we'd been told. So Reagan was wise on one level, and rode it out. Although part of that is because he had the trust of Americans. He had that bumper that Nixon never had, that these other folks never had. And of course, Nixon didn't have it because he was untrustworthy. We knew that from the tapes. He was lying all the way, whereas I don't think Reagan was. So then he goes right on to say and says, but I have to take full responsibility for my own actions and for those of my administration. And as angry as I might be about those activities that were taken without my knowledge, I'm still accountable for those activities. And as disappointed as I may be in those who served for me, I'm still the one that has to answer to the American people for that. So, you know, and finally acknowledges that his previous assertions, and he had been absolutely dogmatic about that. No, we were not trading arms for hostages. He has to come out here and say, a few months ago, I told you, the American people, I didn't trade arms for hostages. My heart, my best intentions tell me that is still true. But the facts tell me, the evidence tell me that actually that is what we did. And yet, Reagan being Reagan, this runs counter to my own beliefs, to administration policy and the original strategy we had in mind, and essentially stands up, says, I'll take the blame for that. And of course, while his image suffers, the reality is Reagan's popularity completely recovers. His second term in 89, he ends with the highest approval rating of any president since FDR. So pretty impressive. Pretty impressive. Here's the downside, of course, under his watch. The guy who ran on a balanced budget, total debt doubled, more than doubled. And if you actually look at it, his supply side tax cut really was voodoo economics. It didn't work. And we need to realize that. Now, the reality is that that's just a truth and a fact. And it's going to have a massive impact on this guy because, of course, George Bush goes on to become president. This George H.W. Bush. Remember, what had he done? And this was that point I said we'd have to talk about. While he'd been a politician early in his career, he became one of the first of what I call the technocrats, the guys who know how government runs and how to run government, more so than how to be a politician. He's not good at telling people what they want to hear. He tries it, and he tries it with this. He goes along with the GOP that has fallen in love with Reagan at this point and says, yep, read my lips, no new taxes, because that's what they told him he had to say if he wanted that nomination to be president. And in reality, he's going to go back on that. And that's how come he only got one term, because he annoyed the party. And remember, here is a perfect example. Reagan, the outsider, stood beyond the party. They couldn't touch him. They couldn't stop him from getting it. They'd stopped him in 76. He still came back in 80 and got it and took the American people with him. Herbert Walker Bush, gets the presidential nod, but then has essentially the presidency taken away from him when, he doesn't stay true to what he had told them. So, pointedly realize that George Bush did the right thing in raising those taxes to prevent, the skyrocketing that we come to see later when his son just pays no attention to it and just goes, yeah, whatever. But he actually, was doing the right thing, but that's because he's a technocrat. He knows where the levers of power are. Now, speaking of those levers of power, one of the things he does as former CIA director, now turned president, when he's heading on his way out of office, he will pardon the 4 CIA agents that had gotten convicted. So they too do not do it. In fact, most of the others, none of them will ever did it. And we do have a note here from one of the people that's out there, one of your classmates, who says, Reagan was a Teflon man, and they always talked about trickle down economics. And his point is the point I was kind of making: trickle down economics doesn't work when there's so much greed at the top. And remember, we have seen up to this point a huge, you've gone from 30 to 60 to 120 times the amount of money that a CEO makes as opposed to a worker in that CEO's plant. Back in the 50s, it would have been almost unheard of to think that the GM guy would get more than 30 to 50 times what a line worker would make. Well, now, of course, you're into the millions in difference. So, and I will ask you, when was GM healthier? When you were paying those guys all that much to get the stock market on board, or before, when those guys had to make sure that there was a company there the next week? Now, all that said, we need to remember there's new stars coming into the sky in music, and that again is a big deal. And remember something else that's happening right here at this point: we're changing over to digital music, we're changing over to CDs. And thus you're also seeing some groups come out that I don't mention here, but Alan Parsons, somebody who the Alan Parsons Project, where much of the true efforts in the studio can be heard. And of course, in some ways, Hart comes through on that as well. And here's Don Henley there again, back to the Deadhead sticker, and hopefully now you see that he's singing with somebody named Stevie Nicks there. And of course, the group we saw referenced before, U2, definitely would be considered populous. And these are some of the new heroes that are populating our screens. But I guess there's real life heroes that we have to remember too. And some of you may already know what's going to happen here when you see that plane in that shot so low that is over Sioux City. And of course, it takes us back to that moment in July 1989. And I can't read this line, "God saved him, I just carried him out." I can't read that line without getting a little choked up. You could say that is Sioux City's finest hour. And, here's this case where disaster preparedness pays off. This plane had never intended to land in Sioux City. Just 185 lived through this catastrophic wreck. And Sioux City hospitals, the emergency services, you saw that was Cushing. It turned out from all over to show up in Sioux City to be transporting people back. But of course, business is changing as well. I talked about the changes with computers. Here's a big one that guy out, I'd mentioned Ted Waite before. What's the big thing he does with he's putting together computers at a lower price, putting the parts together. And it's almost the old Zenith thing: the quality goes in before the name goes on. That may sound a little odd, but one of the things he said was, there's going to be a radical change. This internet stuff is coming. Every computer we sell, we're going to sell with a modem, and we're going to sell it with a CD-ROM player. And that is a huge thing, and Gateway will take off in sales. And then as Y2K comes along, it'll go even farther and faster up. But that's going to take us into the 1990s. But don't think that those secret groups, you now have an ex-CIA director as president. Don't think that those secret groups have gone away. As I'd said, we're putting forces into Venezuela and other South American countries to try to disrupt the drug flow. And yet Americans know nothing about it. Again, here's somebody that knows where the true levers of power are at. But at that same time, the wall is coming down. And I have to tell you, I guess I never really thought that I would see that come down. I'd watched it go up on TV programs. I really didn't think I'd be watching a TV show when it came down. But, and, here's George Bush, and a former ambassador, a former CIA director, certainly capable as a president. But, we still, even though the USSR is imploding, we still conceive of our foreign policy as it's got to be an us and them issue. We win, you lose. It can't be a joint thing. And that will cause us great troubles. It causes us troubles with those Arab oil issues. It causes us especially troubles in the Latin America problems, where it's about income gaps and not Russian inspired plots. Now, here's something you need to think about. And I didn't really make this a big point, but you need to realize it. One of the things that's driving change in America then and today is back in 1965. And this was not a great society move. This was a congressional move brought forward by businesses. They rewrote the immigration laws that had been on the books since about 1924, which had tried to keep people they considered less desirable out of the US. They had limits on Asians, they had limits on Southern. Essentially, all of the 1924 Immigration Act had been, they wanted Northern Europeans. And what happened in 65 is they get rid of some of that. Part of that is because, of course, business loves having lots of extra people available to work, because why? It keeps the workforce prices down. And by now, by the 1980s, right here in Sioux City, we're seeing some of the results of that in the 1980s. Really, we saw it as part of that strike effort that we saw back in the 1970s that I talked about last week. But we're still getting into things nationally that are causing difficulties for Americans across, the way, because the CIA director Bush was well aware that Noriega, who at that time was in the intelligence area, was a paid CIA asset. He's now well aware that there's charges of Noriega as a drug trafficker and knows that they are true. So what do? We invade Panama in a rather shocking surprise for a lot of people. And we're also putting troops authorized by the president into places we don't really maybe or may not know what they're doing there or why. And that led to the Mogadishu, which now we know is Somalia, debacle in 1993, Black Hawk Down, where they're in there, and it comes up right after, not long after the election, when the first of the baby boomers are taking office. And that, of course, was a total surprise. You had a World War II vet getting voted out in favor of a couple of boomers. And when the Mogadishu thing comes down, it's so amazing to so many people. And the Americans are outraged, by the action itself, but also by the fact that we're there and don't even know why we're there. And the new president, who is all about domestic, just the opposite of Nixon, all about the domestic. He doesn't care about foreign policy issues so much, especially when you think about it. Hey, the Soviet Union, the whole reason of what we've been basing our foreign policy on is coming apart. It's worry, and it's the economy, stupid. Remember, that was the line. It's the economy. So he just says, I'm not going to deal with this, and just flat out withdraws the troops. And that's, quite possibly a very intelligent thing, but that message that sends is not missed by a former ally who's in Afghanistan, who's actually a Saudi Arabian, and is very angered by the fact that there's also US troops stationed in Saudi Arabia, and actually in the holy city in Saudi Arabia. And some of those Westerners, because of all the other people that come with them, some of them are female. and having foreign troops, there is terrible, but having females there is just an outrage. And this guy will essentially declare war on America, but who's listening? So that gets us to the 1980s, gets us through it. We're into early 1992, and that's where we're going to pick it up next time. But I want you thinking about what changes are occurring in America and to society at this time in the 1980s. And again, we see tech is driving so much of that, the satellites, the computers, now the internet. By the end of the 80s, we've got internet. What's driving all these changes? And of course, we've got that issue of the big change of gender issues moving into the workforce. And what has that done? It's if you're a 2-income household, great. But if you're not, then there's also the question, what changes are they making? What changes are they making? Remember what I just said a little earlier? Wow, that had an impact on me in a different way. Here you've got all these people that don't really know the business, but they're in the HR department. Why are they in the HR department? To make sure of those issues between genders. I mean, HR in a large part comes into existence for those reasons, that there are going to be gender issues, and we're going to start seeing more and more of those. Now, here's the other thing, the CPI index, the cost items, is really going up at a steep rate. So even though incomes might be going up, real income is not. And you've got those high areas during those, the Reagan recession. You have such high inflationary times during those that you don't really see it happening. Workforce is expanding. The jobless rate stays high early in the decade. And while pay is decreasing, prices are increasing. So, you're sowing the seeds of dissatisfaction. But also remember, I'd mentioned Nancy Lee Zizi, a Sioux City native earlier, and she, there was one joke that she used to always like to tell, what's a woman's place? Well, a woman's place is in the House, in the White House, in the Senate. Remember, at this point in the 1980s, there are 2 women in the House of Representatives, 2. In 1970, there was only 1. Now, they're not always the same one, because sometimes they're of one party and then the other, etc. But there's 2. And that's kind of a big deal. And by the way, in case you don't know, this woman was first elected to the House of Representatives in 1987. Been there ever since. You might know her today as Nancy Pelosi, or Speaker of the House. So, but remember I said the job site itself is changing, and this is just 83 to 85, looking at the percentages of women to men in similar jobs. Now notice, managers by 85, they're starting to make some headway. They're about 35% female to male. And in the professional side, remember what I said, you're coming out of college, you're just a professional, you're moving into the workforce as a professional, and you're getting close to 50-50. It's really 55-45, but that's changing already by 1985. Is that incredible or what? Well, here's the other incredible part that goes with it. And these are looking just at real wages for real jobs. Her salary is 62% of a man's salary for the same job in 1982. And that has long, that casts out a long shadow over things, if you look at what it costs over the course of a career. Now, 1992 goes down as the year of the woman, because in the Senate, which has had generally 1 woman in the Senate, She's in the Senate now, and in 1992, 4 women are elected to the Senate. It's Barbara Murkowski was the one that was in there. And realize what this really means is suddenly the year of the women, there's 5 women in Congress. Now, the reason why most of these women decided to run was because they really didn't like how it worked out at a Senate confirmation hearing, and the fact that all those men really just refused to take whatever this woman said as seriously when she was talking about how her former boss acted toward her. And funny, most of those women at home listening that had worked in the workforce had no difficulty at all believing what she was saying. So that actually got people running toward that. So, but thank you. The CPI, Consumer Price Index, I just could not get that to roll off my tongue a moment ago. So anyway, the Clarence Thomas Senate hearings, and of course, she had brought up these issues. They were held. He didn't make it, right? They all believed her, and no. In actuality, it was the closest vote in the 20th century for a Senate confirmation hearing. It's 52-48. In other words, it would not have taken, more than 2 changes for that to go the other way. But that is covers tonight. We're going to see a lot of these things. I'm hoping, and do realize that we do owe the Sioux City Public Museum a great deal of thanks for all of this, because they are the ones that provide me with a lot of the local items. But I'm going to try to see if I can unmute you all, if I can get this right. But I would be interested in hearing, excuse me, anything from any of you. And I have, as always, appreciated. All right, asked to unmute. If you guys can unmute, that would be good, because I'm not sure if I know how to do this. Got one. Trying. So Dean and Sandy, I see I got you unmuted. If the rest of you can just try mute all, let's try unmute all. Allow participants. No. Okay. So if you could just, if any of you'd like to say anything, I hope we're covering this at a level you're interested in. I hope we're able to actually, make some sense of all this. But, my whole point is about the concept of, there are changes that have gone on. And remember, we're trying to figure out what kind of things have happened that are making this, the country we see today. So, but I hope you've had a good evening. I know it's a lot of information, but I also want you to note, I think we came pretty close to getting this in on time tonight. Just I worked hard at that. So any thoughts, questions, ideas, anything you'd like to bring up?
Well, it reminded me when you started talking about the cost of gasoline influenced how we built cars. Also, at the same time, the price of natural gas and electricity was going up, and we started a different approach in how we insulate homes and buildings too.
That's very true. That's very true. Anybody else out there? I'm trying to unmute some of these. Anybody feel free. Just reach over and touch that microphone and see if you can unmute. But Also, something I do want to say, and we'll probably spend a little bit of time on it next week. One big thing in the Midwest that I did not cover in this because I just couldn't make it work in this was, we need to realize that I didn't mention a thing about the farm crisis, right? Remember what was happening with, as taxes were going up and incomes going down, on farm properties. We've got a crisis out here, and at the same time, as you mentioned, you've got the price of gas, and remember, a lot of your fertilizers and items do end up as petroleum products. So that becomes a big thing too. So any thoughts? And I do appreciate, was it okay filling out that survey? Because we could use those surveys for some other items as well to gather some of your thoughts to talk about other stuff. Good. Thank you, Sarah.
No, it worked. It was fine.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I know I stumbled a little bit there a couple of times today. I'm sorry. I really appreciate you guys bailing me out with consumer price index and the other things. And thank you so much, Bill, for looking up to see who had survived out of the Jonestown issue. But are these, one of the things you saw in that survey was the idea of whether or not we do an extra class to pick up as much as we can into the 21st century. Another option, of course, is just to postpone it till next term and pick up the 21st century then. But kind of leaving that up to you. I could do the additional one. I really felt it was important to go back to that 1950s to pick that up, because as I was doing the research, it was just so clear that so much of that, had to be covered. So I'll be reading your surveys and see what you think. I'll be talking to Mara to see what we can come up with on that as well. But I just want to thank you for your patience. I mean, I really like to have more interaction. Dr. Dunker, did you get that link that had taking you to the webpage where the links for the 50s were in there for the clips that you could see? And with that, I'm doing the same thing. I'm doing the same thing for the concept of the 60s, 70s, 80s. The irony is I'm too focused on the 60s. I want it all to be right. It's becoming massive. I've got more written on the 70s and 80s, and we'll get those links out a lot faster. I may just send you the links for the 60s separately. But when you get all done with this, you're going to have stuff to read as well, just for the fun of it, I hope. So, Bill,
Russ, to answer your question, yes, I did. And thank you very much.
Okay, good. Excellent. Bill just asked a question. What was the origin of the word gateway again? What it was is Sioux City had declared themselves the international airport. Remember, they were trying to get rid of the SUX for the airport that the FAA had given them. Sioux City sucks. So they tried to change the name to the Gateway International Airport, playing off the concept that we were the gateway to the West with the Lewis and Clark Group and everything else. And what had happened then, they were making those hangar areas that were not being used, because remember I said under the deregulation of airlines, we'd really gotten down to where we had very few airlines flying out of Sioux City anymore, United and one other at that time. So they rented out as starter places, the hangars, and that's where and remember, you're bringing all these parts in from other areas. So he needed a big place, and the hangar seemed big enough to start with. So he called it the Gateway Computer. And of course, he looked way out ahead 20 years and said, oh, we'll call it Gateway 2000. 2000's a long way off. And of course, they would last until past 2000. So with all of that, that is a big thing. But that's where that's how they got the name Gateway, because of course they had assumed they'd stay in Sioux City. But of course, another thing that happened was in that concept, of A, hating taxes, and B, you know, uh, things that change as a business development thing, where you've got, any time you got state lines, you try and pull those people from the other places. South Dakota's, no taxation for income, no income tax, made a big deal. And of course, that's where they located their plant when, and they needed large amount of space on top of that. And so at North Dakota, or excuse me, South Dakota and North Sioux had a lot available for that, and at a cheap price. So that's how they ended up over there. But they still had the name Gateway from the airport that came with them. So there you go. So anybody else? And I'm really sorry that I muted some of you, because it looks like you're not unmuting. But other than that, I hope you've had a good evening. And if you can't unmute and have a question, you can write it in the chat. You can always email it to me at rgifford@russgifford.net. And next week I'm going to try to basically make it from essentially 92 to 2008. So we'll get essentially from through 93 all the way up to the Great Recession and what comes up with that. So that's where we're at, and hopefully I'll see you all here next week. Did you have fun?
Good.
Was the audio any better? I went out and bought a different microphone. I got a different light. I've got a different computer for that matter. So
No, looks good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The audio was better.
okay, good.
Much
I'd
better,
gone and
yes.
I'd listened to one of them back, and I went, oh my gosh, that's terrible. I don't like the sounds of that. So I invested in a microphone, and it seems to be working. So yay, that's good.
Good.
Yeah,
All right.
very good.
Very good.
Thank you all. You have
Thank
a
you.
great night, and
Yeah.
I
Happy
hope to see you next
Thanksgiving.
week. Yeah,
Yeah.
happy Thanksgiving to all of you, and thank you very much.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
All right.
Yeah,
Good
good
night.
night.
Good night.
Good night. And by the way, Bill says happy Thanksgiving to everybody. So bye-bye.